My name is Elizabeth, and until recently, I thought I had seen everything a marriage could throw my way. Joseph and I had been together for 10 years. 10 long years of love routine and occasional tension, like any couple. But what happened recently has left me questioning everything I knew about him, about us, and even about myself. It started one quiet evening in our living room. Joseph had been acting strangely for weeks, distant but also unusually attentive, as though he were overcompensating for something. I finally asked him what was going on. Instead of the excuses I expected, he looked me in the eye and said, "Elizabeth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise not to freak out." Now, when your husband starts a conversation like that, your mind automatically races to the worst possible conclusions. I braced myself. Was he sick? Did he lose his job? Or worse, was he seeing someone else? But no, what he said was far more bizarre. "I want you to spend time with 2 men I know," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "What?" I laughed, thinking it had to be a joke. "Joseph, what are you talking about?" "I'm serious," he said. "Hear me out? You're always saying how routine our lives have become. I thought maybe this could spice things up. Give us both something to think about. It doesn't have to mean anything." I stared at him, utterly baffled. "You're asking me to spend time with other men. What does that even mean?" "Nothing inappropriate." He rushed to clarify, "Just get to know them. Talk to them. It's not what you're thinking. These are friends of mine. Colleagues, really. They've been through a lot. And I thought maybe you could bring some kindness into their lives. You're so good at that." This was absurd. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Joseph," I said firmly, "if you think I'm going to entertain your friends just because you've decided our lives are boring, you've lost your mind." But he didn't back down, in fact. He leaned in closer, his voice almost whisper. "It's not about me, it's about us. Trust me, Elizabeth. Just meet them once, and if you feel uncomfortable, we'll never talk about it again." I wanted to argue. I wanted to refuse outright. But something in his tone, the desperation, the insistence, made me pause. Over the years, I had learned to trust Joseph, even when I didn't understand him. This felt like one of those moments when he was asking for my faith, even if he couldn't explain why. Reluctantly, I agreed. "Fine, one meeting, but if this gets weird, I'm out." Joseph smiled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he said. "You won't regret it." Little did I know, that single decision would unravel our lives in ways I never imagined. The day of the meeting arrived faster than I had anticipated. I spent the morning convincing myself this wasn't as strange as it seemed. Joseph had made it clear there were no hidden motives. Still, the butterflies in my stomach refused to settle. "Where are we meeting them?" I asked Joseph as he drove us across town at a quiet little cafe. He replied, "Someplace neutral, so there's no pressure." Neutral, no pressure. The entire situation felt like pressure personified. I didn't know what to expect, and Joseph wasn't offering much reassurance. When we arrived, I immediately noticed 2 men sitting at a corner table. They stood out, not just because they were both tall and striking, but also because they exuded a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. Joseph waved at them and gestured for me to follow him. "Elizabeth," he said, "this is Marcus and Darnell." Marcus had an air of charisma that was almost magnetic, with a warm smile that put me slightly at ease. Darnell, on the other hand, was more reserved, his expression thoughtful and intense. Both greeted me politely, and for a moment, I wondered if I had overreacted about the whole thing. We sat down, and the conversation started innocently enough. They asked about my work, my interests, and even shared some stories about their careers. Marcus was a corporate consultant, while Darnell worked in community outreach. Their lives sounded fascinating, and as the minutes passed, I found myself genuinely intrigued. But then the question started to shift. So Elizabeth Marcus began leaning forward slightly. "What made you agree to meet us today?" I glanced at Joseph, who gave me an encouraging nod. "Honestly," I said, "I'm not entirely sure Joseph suggested it, and I'm still trying to figure out why." Darnell's lips curled into a faint smile. "We were surprised too. He admitted Joseph spoke very highly of you. Said you had a way of making people feel seen and understood. That caught me off guard. Joseph had never been the type to gush about me, at least not in front of others. He also said you've been feeling a little disconnected." Marcus added, his tone gentle but probing. "Is that true?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was I disconnected? Maybe. Marriage wasn't always easy, and there were times when I felt like Joseph, and I were more roommates than partners, but admitting that to strangers felt wrong. I wouldn't say that I replied cautiously. Marriage has its ups and downs like anything else. Marcus nodded, as if he understood more than I was letting on. Of course. But sometimes, stepping outside the usual can help you see things differently. His words unsettled me, and I couldn't pinpoint why. The conversation continued, weaving through lighter topics, but the undercurrent of something deeper never quite disappeared. As we wrapped up, Marcus and Darnell both expressed their gratitude. "It's rare to meet someone so genuine," Darnell said, his voice sincere. I thanked them and turned to Joseph. As we walked back to the car, "Well," he asked. "They seem nice," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But I still don't understand what this was all about." Joseph smiled, his expression unreadable. "You'll see," he said cryptically. "And that night, as I lay in bed replaying the day's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning." The days after that meeting were strange. Joseph seemed lighter, almost cheerful, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. I, on the other hand, was consumed by unease. Something about the encounter with Marcus and Darnell nodded me. Though I couldn't put my finger on it, it wasn't until Marcus called me. Yes, called me that everything began to spiral. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I just wanted to thank you again for meeting with us the other day." I hesitated. "How did you get my number?" "Joseph gave it to me," he said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He thought we might continue our conversation. You're really easy to talk to." And I felt like there was more to say. More to say about what? My pulse quickened as I struggled to maintain my composure. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said. "This whole situation feels unusual." "I understand," Marcus replied, his tone unflappable. "But if you ever feel like talking, I'm here." I ended the call quickly, my mind racing. Why would Joseph give Marcus my number without telling me? When I confronted him that evening, his response only deepened the mystery. "I thought you'd appreciate the gesture." Joseph said, his expression calm. "You seem to connect with them." "Connect? Joseph, I barely know them." "That's the point," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe it's time you got to know someone else, saw yourself through their eyes." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. "Are you listening to yourself?" Why are you so invested in this? Joseph's eyes softened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability. Because I want you to be happy, he said, and I don't know if I can give you that anymore. The room seemed to spin. What are you talking about? I've seen the way you look at me lately, he continued, like you're going through the motions. I thought maybe if you had a new perspective, you'd find what you're looking for, even if it's not with me. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he trying to push me away? To sabotage our marriage? Or worse, was this his way of absolving himself of something he had already done? Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I froze as Joseph walked over to answer it. Standing there as if summoned by some invisible force were Marcus and Darnell. What are they doing here? I demanded, my voice shaking. I invited them. Joseph said, his tone maddeningly calm. Marcus stepped inside, his demeanor composed, but his eyes sharp. We just wanted to check on you, Elizabeth. Make sure everything's all right. Everything is not all right. I snapped, my frustration boiling over. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm done with all of it. But as I turned to leave, Darnell's voice stopped me. Elizabeth, wait. He said, there's something you need to know. The room fell silent. Darnell glanced at Joseph, then back at me. This wasn't just about you, he said. It was about him too. Joseph asked us to meet you because he wanted us to show you something he couldn't. I felt the ground beneath me shift. Show me what? That you're worth more than you've been settling for, Darnell said softly. Joseph thinks he's failed you, and he thought if you saw yourself through someone else's eyes, you might realize how much you deserve. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Joseph looked at me, his expression raw and unguarded. I just wanted you to feel alive again, he said, even if it meant letting you go. My mind reeled. Was this love manipulation? Self-sacrifice? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. My marriage was no longer the safe, predictable world I had thought it was. That night, as I lay awake beside a man I thought I knew, I realized the story was far from over. The choices I made next would shape not just my future, but the truth of who I wanted to be.